We all want to help one another. Human beings are like that.
About 3,000 of you subscribe, but only about 200 are getting notifications, so click the bell and click all. You are being lied to. You're being lied to by both sides of a particular issue, each wanting to press their own ideological and cultural ends. The lies are about critical race theory. One side wants to tell you that this is simply an academic legal discipline, fairly esoteric, concerned with social and racial justice, and wants you to ignore the racist and unscientific underpinnings of its ideas. The other side wants to exploit the backlash against the excesses of critical race theory to wipe clean history and to sweep under the carpet objectively bad things that have happened and in many cases are still happening. So what actually is critical race theory? Well, we'll have to go several layers deep to explain that. Critical race theory purports to be an academic examination of the law as it affects minorities within the culture, ethnic minorities within the culture. It also challenges and criticizes liberal approaches to racial justice. You might know these liberal approaches to racial justice as racism is bad, always, treat everyone equally, and the idea of colourblindness, that colour doesn't matter, that it should be ignored. If you're at all rationally minded or prioritise fairness and equality, you can probably already see the issues with critical race theory and how it violates the previous prevailing attitudes and ideas about how you solve the problem of racism. To understand this more deeply, however, you have to go back into critical legal studies. Critical legal studies was the precursor to critical race theory. Critical race theory is really just critical legal studies applied particularly to race. The central claim of critical legal studies is that laws are, not can be, are, used to codify society's biases against marginalized groups and to maintain the status quo. The goals of critical legal studies are said to be to demonstrate the ambiguous and biased nature of laws that are supposed to be impartial and set, to publicize the historical results of such laws, and to increase transparency and understanding of legal processes amongst the public. Given the obfuscatory nature of postmodern academia's circumlocutions around a broad diversity of topics upon which it impinges, I postulate that at the bare minimum we can say that they have failed to achieve success on that last particular. But to understand critical legal studies, you need to understand critical theory. Critical theory is a technique of social philosophy that assesses and critiques society and culture. They do this to ferret out and challenge what it considers to be power structures. It originates within sociology, a soft science that's barely a science, and literary theory, which isn't a science at all. Literary theory is about the subjective interpretation of creative works. That really has nothing whatsoever to do with objective reality, and shouldn't have the influence that it does. Critical theory argues that the problems we have in the world are, at least in part, and sometimes wholly, to do with the structure of society and our assumptions, rather than by individual actions or psychology, or the accrual of those. They claim that ideology reinforced by media is a block to human liberation and progress. Right, now, hold on to your butts, because we're going to get into conspiracy theory territory. Critical theory, especially when capitalized, refers to the approach and ideas put forward by the Frankfurt School. Dun dun dun. Those people responsible for the idea of cultural Marxism. Dun dun dun. Contrary to what some paranoiacs might tell you, cultural Marxism was a thing, but not a conspiracy theory. Not a conspiracy to undermine the West. Rather, it was using a Marxist filter, a Marxist lens, for examining and criticizing culture. That's the important part to take from here, and probably from critical theory as a whole. This embrace of bias and subjectivity, the rejection of modernism and the Enlightenment, the capacity, the capability to problematize just about anything by wielding deliberately biased and subjective thinking. To understand that, you have to understand postmodernism. Postmodernism is a philosophical movement characterized by hyperskepticism, irony, and the rejection of modernism and the Enlightenment. Modernism was centered around the progressive idea that we as humans could improve our relations with one another and improve our world, or even create our environment, through understanding and application of science, technology, and objectivity. Postmodernism is the rejection of that in the same way that Romanticism was a rejection of the Enlightenment. I would say that the rejection of the Enlightenment led to the collapse of liberal pluralism in the 20th century and the embrace of nationalism and fascism, just as postmodernism is doing something very much the same in the 21st century. Your mileage may vary. Postmodernism rejects ideas of objective reality, truth itself, the idea of human nature, the ideal of reason, the application of science and social progress through knowledge. Okay, so let's roll all of that back up. Postmodernism rejects objective reality, truth, knowledge, science, and the idea of progress via liberal, rational means. Critical theory applies those rejections by embracing subjectivity and the use of distorting critical lenses. It engages in a kind of sociological pareidolia and pattern-seeking, trying to problematize everything and to see it through that very narrow lens. It then seeks to solve the things that it has problematized or conjured out of thin air through an equally biased lens. Critical legal studies uses critical theory on the law in particular, problematizing the law or its application using similarly deliberately biased lenses. Critical race theory is the application of critical legal studies to laws as they intersect with minority communities, but has in practice gone back a step to be the application of critical theory with a racially biased lens upon all aspects of society. And that brings us to today and the current conflict. Critical race theory today is a deliberately subjective mode of analysis of politics, history, culture, everything. It views everything through a racialized and radicalized lens and willfully seeks to interpret everything through a racialized lens. It redefines terms because critical theory and postmodernism believe in the power of language as if it can magically change reality. Thus, they have changed the meaning of racism, or are attempting to change the meaning of racism, from prejudice on the basis of race to racial prejudice plus power. Being willfully subjective, it is immune to accusations of hypocrisy because there is no check or balance within its underlying philosophy not to be a self-contradictory hypocrite. And similarly, it is immune to reason and objective reality because it rejects those as very ideas. Thus, it's perfectly secure in claiming to be anti-racist while peddling ideas like whiteness or engaging in blatant and overt racism towards white people and increasingly white-adjacent people like East and South Asians. To understand the problem, try thinking about it like this. You're a doctor. A hypochondriac comes into your office claiming to have an exotic illness. Should you listen to or prioritize their subjective personal experience of their symptoms, or should you check them over, check their pulse, check their blood pressure, look over them for rashes, take blood samples and see what they report back, and then form an objective view of whether they're ill or not? Critical theory is sociological hypochondria, and all it seems to do all it seems to suggest as a solution to whatever problems it happens to have found within society, real or imagined, is simply to invert whatever power dynamics are supposedly at play. Should we teach about our racist pasts? Yes, we probably should. Conservatives shouldn't get to use this backlash to eradicate our past, to get rid of things that they are rightfully ashamed of, to brush them aside, so that they can make people feel exceptional, nationalistic. No, we should face up to our past, but we should also record and note the progress that we have made, and how this racist past was undone, things we should be proud of. Should we teach people to be racist against white people? That whiteness is an indelible stain, a secular original sin upon anyone who happens to have pale skin? Absolutely not. There's a difference between teaching about racism, teaching an unvarnished version of history. There's a difference between that and teaching people to be racist, or to be ashamed of their racial identity, which these people will claim is a social construct anyway. We should teach the objective truth, or as close to it as we can get, about our past. But we should no more accept critical race theory than we should accept the teaching of white supremacy in class. If we would reject having a neo-Nazi come in and do a lecture to a school about how all black people are inferior, then we should equally reject a black supremacist coming in to teach how all white people are evil. Kimberly Crenshaw might have coined the term, but it has moved beyond her now. Besides, given Death of the Author, an aspect of literary criticism that influences critical theory, just because she made up the term doesn't mean she knows what it means. And that's the trouble with subjectivity. In the end, my subjectivity equals or even trumps yours. Zang. Postmodern Studios, role-playing games, and a lot more to die for. Post-mort.com